In early August 1944, France was still reeling from the brutal fighting in Normandy. 2 months had passed since the Allied landings on D-Day, June 6, 1944. The invasion had been a success, but progress after the landings was painfully slow. The hedgerow country of Normandy, with its thick, high walls of earth and brush, turned every field into a fortress. German defenders used the terrain to their advantage. They set up machine gun nests and anti-tank positions, forcing the Allies to fight for every yard. For weeks, the front barely moved. Soldiers were exhausted, supplies were stretched thin, and Allied commanders faced mounting pressure to break the stalemate. Then, in late July, everything changed. The U.S. Army launched Operation Cobra, a massive offensive aimed at breaking through German lines west of St. Lo. Bombers pounded German positions, leaving them shattered and disorganized. Through the gap that opened, General George S. Patton and his newly activated U.S. Third Army surged forward. Patton was known for his aggressive style and demand for speed. His army was built for movement. It was made up of fast armored divisions supported by infantry, artillery, and close air support. Once unleashed, it became a storm rolling across the French countryside. In just 30 days, Patton's Third Army swept across France in a campaign that stunned both allies and enemies. Beginning at Avranches, his forces poured through the breach created by Operation Cobra. From there, they drove south and east, taking cities like Le Mans and Orleans in rapid succession. By early September, they reached the Moselle River near Metz, close to the German border. Along the way, they liberated towns and villages that had been under German control for 4 long years. Civilians cheered as American tanks roared past, waving flags and welcoming their liberators. It was a dramatic reversal of fortune. Only weeks earlier, the Allies had been bogged down in slow, costly fighting. Now, the front moved so fast that even Allied high command struggled to keep up. The speed of Patton's advance was made possible by careful planning and a relentless focus on logistics. Armored warfare is hungry work. Tanks need fuel, ammunition, and constant maintenance. To keep the Third Army moving, the Allies set up a supply system called the Red Ball Express. Hundreds of trucks ran day and night, carrying fuel and supplies to the front. Military police directed traffic on special priority roads, ensuring nothing slowed the flow. This lifeline kept Patton's tanks rolling. Without it, the advance would have stalled in days. Patton's forces relied heavily on the M4 Sherman tank. The Sherman was not as heavily armored as German tanks like the Panther or Tiger, but it was reliable, easy to repair, and could be produced in large numbers. American crews used speed and numbers to outmaneuver German armor. Alongside the tanks, self-propelled artillery and tank destroyers provided fire support. Air cover came from P-47 Thunderbolt fighters, which strafed and bombed German positions ahead of the advance. Communication between units was handled by radio, allowing Patton's commanders to respond quickly to changing conditions on the battlefield. The German army was unprepared for such a rapid Allied thrust. After the failed defense of Normandy, many German units were in disarray. They were short on fuel and ammunition. Some divisions relied on horse-drawn carts to move supplies, a stark contrast to the mechanized American forces. As Patton's tanks surged forward, German commanders scrambled to form defensive lines, but they were repeatedly outflanked. Town after town fell before defenses could be organized. One of the most dramatic moments of the campaign came at the Falaise Pocket. As German forces tried to retreat east, Allied forces closed in from the north and south, trapping tens of thousands of German troops. Patton's units pressed hard from the south, cutting off escape routes and sealing the pocket. The result was a disaster for Germany. Thousands were killed or captured, and whole divisions were destroyed. The destruction at Falaise opened the road to the rest of France. From there, Patton pushed east at full speed. His orders were clear: keep moving, keep the enemy off balance, and never give them time to regroup. Soldiers sometimes advanced so quickly that they rode on top of tanks or in hastily commandeered vehicles. There were few pauses for rest. For the men on the ground, it was exhausting but exhilarating. They had endured the grinding, slow combat of Normandy. Now they were part of a lightning war that seemed unstoppable. As the Third Army advanced, scenes of liberation unfolded across the countryside. In towns and villages, French civilians greeted their liberators with tears and celebration. Flags appeared in windows. Resistance fighters emerged from hiding to fight alongside the Americans. In some places, they provided critical intelligence, guiding Patton's units through back roads and pointing out enemy positions. These moments brought a human face to the war. For the people of France, the sight of Allied tanks meant the end of years of occupation and fear. On the German side, morale collapsed. Soldiers who had been told that France would hold were shocked by how quickly the Allies advanced. Many surrendered rather than fight hopeless battles. Those who tried to resist often found themselves outmaneuvered or cut off. German commanders faced impossible decisions as their forces were split and scattered. Every day brought new crises, and every attempt to form a solid defense was swept aside. By early September, Patton's tanks reached the Moselle River near Metz. France was largely liberated, but the rapid pace of the advance had stretched supply lines to the breaking point. The Red Ball Express could not keep up with the enormous demand for fuel and ammunition. At times, tanks were forced to halt simply because they had run out of gas. Patton was frustrated, but he knew his army could not fight without supplies. This pause allowed the Germans to regroup behind their border defenses, setting the stage for future battles. In just 1 month, Patton's Third Army had changed the face of the war in Western Europe. The Allies had gone from a slow, bloody struggle in Normandy to a sweeping advance across hundreds of miles of territory. The speed and scale of the movement shocked the Germans and gave new hope to the Allies. For the soldiers who fought it and the civilians who witnessed it, the campaign was unforgettable. The Third Army was built to move fast and hit hard. It was made up of 6 armored divisions and many infantry divisions, all working together under a single command. Each armored division had hundreds of tanks, supported by artillery, engineers, and supply units. Infantry divisions followed to hold the ground that the tanks had taken. Above them, Allied aircraft provided constant cover and support. This combination gave Patton the tools he needed to break through German lines and keep pushing without pause. The heart of Patton's striking power was the M4 Sherman tank. The Sherman was not the most powerful tank of the war, but it was reliable and easy to repair. American factories could build them quickly, and replacement parts were always available. A Sherman could cross bridges, move through rough terrain, and operate for long stretches without breaking down. Tank crews knew their machines could be fixed in the field, which gave them confidence to keep moving. Alongside the Shermans were tank destroyers like the M10 Wolverine. These vehicles had powerful guns designed to take out German tanks at a distance. They were not as heavily armored as the Sherman, but they were fast and packed a punch. Self-propelled artillery followed the armored columns, providing heavy fire when needed. This mix of speed, firepower, and flexibility gave the Third Army a strong edge in mobile warfare. None of this would have been possible without logistics. A tank without fuel is just a block of steel, and Patton's army burned through enormous amounts of fuel and ammunition every day. To keep the advance moving, the Allies set up a massive supply network known as the Red Ball Express. This was a continuous convoy of trucks that ran day and night from supply depots near the coast to the front lines. Drivers worked in shifts, often under dangerous conditions, to deliver gasoline, shells, food, and spare parts. Military police cleared special roads for these convoys so nothing would slow them down. Without this constant flow of supplies, Patton's tanks would have been forced to stop within days. The Red Ball Express became as important to the campaign as the tanks themselves. Communication was another key factor. In earlier wars, commanders often had to wait hours or even days to learn what was happening at the front. Patton's army used radio to cut that time to minutes. Every tank, truck, and command post had radios that allowed orders to move quickly up and down the chain of command. Patton's headquarters could issue new instructions almost instantly, and frontline units could report changes just as fast. This made it possible to react to German movements before they could take shape. It also allowed for rapid coordination between ground forces and aircraft. When a German position was spotted, P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers could be called in to strike within minutes. Reconnaissance was constant. Cavalry units in light vehicles scouted ahead of the main force, mapping roads, bridges, and enemy positions. They often operated miles ahead of the main columns, feeding information back by radio. In the air, P-47s and other planes kept watch for German troop movements. This constant flow of information kept Patton's army one step ahead. German units rarely had time to dig in before being attacked. The enemy was never sure where the next strike would come from, which created confusion and fear. The Germans were at a serious disadvantage. After their defeat in Normandy, many of their units were scattered and disorganized. They lacked fuel, ammunition, and vehicles. Some divisions had been reduced to half their normal strength or worse. Many were forced to use horse-drawn wagons to move supplies, a sign of how far their logistics had fallen behind. These wagons were slow and vulnerable to air attack. German troops trying to retreat often found themselves stranded when horses were killed or bridges destroyed. In contrast, Patton's forces could move quickly and maintain their momentum. German tanks like the Panzer and Tiger were technically superior to the Sherman in many ways. They had thicker armor and more powerful guns. But these advantages were less important in a campaign built on speed. German tanks were few in number and often ran out of fuel before they could be used effectively. They were also harder to repair and replace. When a Tiger tank was destroyed, it could take weeks or months to get another one to the front. Patton's strategy was to keep moving, bypass strong points when possible, and strike deep into the enemy's rear. This left German commanders trying to guess where the next blow would fall. The speed of the Third Army created problems even for the Allies. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles. A single bridge collapse or traffic jam could delay vital fuel shipments. Patton's staff worked constantly to solve these problems. Engineers built temporary bridges across rivers. Military police directed traffic to prevent bottlenecks. Convoy routes were adjusted daily to keep the flow steady. Every part of the machine had to work smoothly or the advance would falter. The pace of the campaign placed heavy demands on the soldiers themselves. Tank crews spent long hours inside cramped vehicles, sometimes moving for days without proper rest. Infantry marched alongside, ready to fight when resistance appeared. Supply drivers faced long, dangerous trips under blackout conditions, guided only by dim headlights and road markers. Despite the hardships, morale stayed high because the troops could see the results of their efforts. Every day brought new towns liberated and enemy units destroyed. The rapid advance was proof that their sacrifices were making a difference. By early September, Patton's army had advanced hundreds of miles. The Germans were in full retreat, unable to mount an organized defense. The Third Army had proven that speed, coordination, and logistics could overcome even well-armed opponents. The campaign showed the power of modern mechanized warfare and set the stage for the final drive into Germany. In late July 1944, the front in Normandy finally cracked. For weeks, the Allies had been locked in bitter, slow fighting among the hedgerows. German defenses were well prepared and stubborn, holding the Allies back despite heavy losses. Then came Operation Cobra. American bombers unleashed a massive aerial assault on German positions west of St. Lo. The ground shook under the weight of thousands of bombs. When the smoke cleared, a gap appeared in the German lines. This was the opening Patton had been waiting for. His Third Army, newly activated and ready for combat, poured through the breach at Avranches. The speed of the breakthrough shocked the Germans. They had been expecting more of the same grinding, cautious advances that had defined the battle for Normandy. Instead, they were suddenly facing a fast-moving armored force that refused to stop. Tanks and mechanized infantry surged forward, bypassing pockets of resistance and cutting off retreat routes. German units that tried to hold their ground were quickly encircled or destroyed. Confusion spread through their ranks as reports came in of enemy forces appearing far behind their lines. Communications broke down, and commanders struggled to understand the scale of the disaster. As Patton's forces widened the gap, they pushed toward Le Mans, a vital crossroads for German logistics. Capturing Le Mans would disrupt enemy movements and prevent reinforcements from reaching the front. The advance was relentless, American columns drove through towns and villages at a pace that stunned both friend and foe. German troops who tried to regroup were hit before they could establish a defensive line. Patton's guiding principle was simple: keep moving forward. Speed itself became a weapon. Every mile gained made it harder for the Germans to form a coherent response. The German high command realized the danger too late. Hitler had ordered his forces to counterattack in Normandy rather than retreat to more defensible positions. This decision left many divisions exposed and vulnerable when the American breakthrough came. As German units began to fall back, they did so in disorganized clusters rather than in a coordinated withdrawal. This set the stage for one of the most decisive moments of the campaign: the Battle of the Falaise Pocket. As American forces advanced from the south and British and Canadian forces pushed from the north, a large portion of the German army found itself trapped. The Allies aimed to close the gap and encircle tens of thousands of enemy troops. Patton's tanks drove hard to seal the southern side of the pocket. The fighting was intense and chaotic. Roads were jammed with retreating German vehicles, horse-drawn wagons, and abandoned equipment. Allied aircraft strafed the columns from above, adding to the destruction. German soldiers fled through fields and forests, many without weapons or supplies. Entire units collapsed under the pressure. For the Allies, closing the Falaise Pocket was a matter of timing. If the gap could be sealed quickly, it would result in the destruction of a major portion of Germany's fighting strength in France. Patton's forces pushed day and night to reach their objectives. On the northern side, British and Canadian units did the same. The gap narrowed until only a few roads remained open. In the final days, the retreat turned into a slaughter. Thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. By the time the pocket was closed, the German army in western France had suffered catastrophic losses. It was a turning point in the campaign, opening the way for a rapid Allied advance across the rest of the country. With the enemy in full retreat, Patton showed no intention of pausing. His army surged forward again, this time racing toward the Seine River. Cities and towns fell in rapid succession. Le Mans, Chartres, Orleans, and Reims were liberated one after another. The pace of the advance was so fast that at times headquarters struggled to keep track of unit positions. Maps became outdated within hours. German defenders were overwhelmed and disoriented. Attempts to set up new defensive lines crumbled before they could be completed. The rapid advance also created opportunities for bold maneuvers. Patton's forces often bypassed strong enemy positions, leaving them isolated. This tactic kept the momentum going and forced the Germans to either abandon those positions or be cut off entirely. It was a form of mobile warfare that relied on constant pressure and the ability to exploit weaknesses as soon as they appeared. Patton understood that hesitation would give the enemy time to recover. He was determined to deny them that chance. Patton's message to his officers was direct and uncompromising. "We're going to keep moving," he told them. "We're not going to wait for the enemy to organize." This approach demanded discipline and endurance from his soldiers. Units were often on the move for days at a time, fighting and advancing without rest. Supply lines had to stretch farther each day to keep up with the pace. Despite the strain, morale remained high. Soldiers could see the results of their efforts in the liberation of towns and the capture of thousands of enemy troops. For the German commanders, the situation was catastrophic. Their forces were in constant retreat, unable to form a stable front. Orders from Berlin were unrealistic and often contradictory. Some units were told to hold ground at all costs, while others were ordered to fall back. The result was chaos. Communication failures added to the confusion. In many cases, local commanders had no clear idea of where neighboring units were or what their missions should be. This disorganization played directly into Patton's hands. By late August, Patton's tanks were approaching the Seine River, threatening to cut off German forces retreating from Paris. The fall of the French capital was imminent. German control of France was collapsing. In a matter of weeks, Patton's Third Army had advanced across hundreds of miles, shattering the enemy's grip on the region. The breakthrough at Avranches had triggered a chain of events that the Germans could not stop. What began as a narrow breach in the lines had become a full-scale rout. The campaign was far from over, but the speed and scope of the advance had already reshaped the war in Western Europe. The men of Patton's Third Army had spent weeks fighting in the thick hedgerows of Normandy. Each field and farm was a battlefield. Progress was measured in feet, and every gain came at a high cost. Many soldiers believed the rest of the campaign would be just as slow and punishing. When the breakout came, they were stunned by the change. Instead of inching forward under constant fire, they were now moving fast, covering miles in a single day. For some, the sudden speed felt unreal. Soldiers rode on top of tanks and half-tracks, clinging to the sides as the vehicles rumbled through villages and open countryside. They moved so quickly that they sometimes bypassed enemy units without even realizing it. As American columns entered towns and villages, they were met with scenes few would forget. French civilians who had lived under German occupation for 4 long years rushed into the streets. They waved flags and shouted their gratitude. Some brought flowers, others offered food and wine to the passing soldiers. Children ran alongside the tanks, trying to keep up. For many of the French, this was the first time they had seen free men in uniform since 1940. The liberation was not just a military event, but a deeply personal moment. Families who had endured years of fear and deprivation were suddenly able to celebrate openly. The joy was overwhelming. Soldiers later recalled the tears, the hugs, and the sheer relief that swept through each liberated town. The advance also brought the French resistance into the open. These fighters had been operating in secret, gathering intelligence, sabotaging rail lines, and harassing German units. As Patton's forces moved through the countryside, resistance members stepped forward to guide them. They pointed out enemy positions, revealed hidden supply dumps, and showed the Americans routes through back roads and fields. Their knowledge of the terrain was invaluable. In some places, resistance fighters fought alongside American troops, using captured German weapons or hunting rifles. Their presence added to the sense that France was rising up as the invaders fell back. For the American soldiers, these encounters were powerful reminders of why they were fighting. The cheering crowds and the gratitude of the liberated people gave meaning to the hardships of the march. At the same time, the rapid pace of the campaign brought new challenges. Units often moved so quickly that they outran their own supplies. Rations grew scarce. Soldiers sometimes went hungry while driving deep into enemy territory. Fuel shortages forced tank crews to halt in open fields and wait for the Red Ball Express to bring more gasoline. Despite these problems, morale stayed high. The men could see that they were winning, and that was enough to keep them going. The reaction among German troops was very different. Many German soldiers had been told that the defenses in Normandy would hold. They were assured that reinforcements would come and that the Allies would be contained near the coast. When the breakthrough came, these promises collapsed. German units that had been ordered to stand firm suddenly found themselves surrounded or cut off. Entire divisions were reduced to scattered groups of men trying to escape through the countryside. Some fought desperately to reach safety. Others threw down their weapons and surrendered. Prisoner cages filled with captured Germans appeared behind the American lines, often overflowing with men who no longer believed the war could be won. The speed of the Allied advance left many German commanders in shock. Orders from Berlin were often unrealistic and contradictory. Some units were told to counterattack while others were told to retreat. Communication lines were broken, and many officers had no clear idea of the overall situation. For the average German soldier, the experience was one of constant retreat and confusion. They marched by night, hid by day, and often had no food or ammunition. Many surrendered simply because they saw no other choice. To them, the Americans seemed unstoppable, appearing from unexpected directions and striking before defenses could be built. Patton himself was everywhere. He believed in leading from the front, and he often traveled near the fighting to see conditions for himself. His command car, a modified Dodge, became a familiar sight along the roads. Soldiers who saw him remembered his polished helmet, his ivory-handled pistols, and his fierce energy. Patton delivered blunt, fiery speeches to his men, urging them to push harder and faster. He demanded constant movement and showed no patience for hesitation. His presence inspired some and intimidated others, but no one doubted his determination. Officers who failed to keep pace heard from him directly, often in language as sharp as the orders he gave. The liberation of each town brought its own scenes of emotion. In one village, residents pulled down the signs the Germans had put up and replaced them with French flags they had hidden for years. In another, church bells rang as American tanks rolled through the streets. Farmers handed out loaves of bread baked that morning, while women poured wine for the troops. These moments contrasted sharply with the destruction of war. Just beyond the cheering crowds were burned-out vehicles, craters, and bodies lying unburied in the fields. For the soldiers, this mix of joy and horror was a constant reminder of what the campaign cost. As the Third Army drove east, the human strain grew. Long marches and sleepless nights took a toll. Tank crews were coated in dust and grease, their uniforms stiff with sweat. Infantrymen's boots wore thin from constant marching. Medical teams worked tirelessly to treat the wounded, often setting up aid stations in farmhouses or barns. Despite exhaustion, the men pressed on because the results were visible. Each day brought new victories, new towns liberated, and more enemy units destroyed or captured. The sense of momentum carried them forward even when supplies ran low or orders seemed impossible. Behind the front, engineers and supply troops faced their own battles. Drivers of the Red Ball Express risked their lives on narrow roads under blackout conditions to deliver fuel and ammunition. Bridges destroyed by retreating Germans had to be rebuilt quickly so the advance could continue. These support units rarely saw the cheering crowds or the headlines, but without them, the drive across France would have ground to a halt. For the people of France, the rapid advance meant freedom but also uncertainty. Some towns were caught in the fighting, their homes and fields destroyed. Others suffered reprisals from retreating German troops. Still, the dominant emotion was relief. 4 years of occupation were ending. Families could speak openly again, raise their flags, and hope for a future without fear. As Patton's columns passed, they left behind a trail of liberated towns and a population eager to rebuild. For the soldiers who witnessed these scenes, the experience left lasting memories of what they had fought to achieve. By early September 1944, the map of Western Europe had changed completely. In a single month, Patton's Third Army and other Allied forces had liberated most of France. The campaign moved so quickly that German authority in the region simply collapsed. Towns and cities that had been under occupation for 4 years were suddenly free. German garrisons that might have held out for weeks under other circumstances either fled or surrendered without a fight. Roads that had been clogged with German troops and supply wagons now ran in reverse, filled with retreating soldiers and abandoned equipment. The rapid collapse shocked even experienced Allied commanders, who had expected a slower advance after the difficult battles in Normandy. For the Allies, the liberation of France was both a military and political victory. The capture of ports, rail lines, and airfields gave the Allied armies a base from which to strike directly into Germany. French infrastructure, though damaged by years of war, provided vital routes for supplies. The Free French forces under General Charles de Gaulle also gained strength as more territory came under Allied control. This strengthened the French position in the coalition and restored a sense of national pride. At the same time, the fall of France shattered German morale. Civilians in Germany could no longer believe in the promise that the Western Front was secure. For German soldiers, the loss was proof that the tide of war had turned decisively against them. The German High Command faced an immediate crisis. The destruction of forces in the Falaise Pocket and the retreat across France left huge gaps in the defensive lines. To fill these gaps, German leaders had to shift divisions from other fronts. Units fighting the Soviets in the east were rushed westward, leaving the Eastern Front weaker. This movement provided the Red Army with breathing room, allowing them to prepare for their own offensives later in the year. For the first time, Germany faced overwhelming pressure on both fronts at once. Every decision came with risk. Reinforcing the West meant weakening the East, while focusing on the East left the Western Front vulnerable to further Allied advances. Patton's rapid push also created serious logistical challenges for the Allies. His army moved so quickly that supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to travel hundreds of miles from ports in Normandy to the front lines. Even with the Red Ball Express working day and night, it was impossible to keep up with the pace of the advance. Trucks broke down, roads became clogged with traffic, and bridges needed constant repair. At times, tanks were forced to stop simply because they ran out of fuel. This was a source of great frustration for Patton, who believed in maintaining constant momentum. He knew that every pause gave the enemy a chance to regroup and build new defenses. The strain on logistics forced Allied commanders to make difficult choices. Supplies were concentrated on certain armies, leaving others with less support. Eisenhower, as supreme commander, had to balance competing demands from Patton in the south and Montgomery in the north. Disagreements arose over strategy and priorities. Patton argued for pushing deep into Germany as quickly as possible, while others favored a more cautious approach. These debates reflected the larger problem of managing a coalition with different goals and methods. While the advance slowed, German forces used the time to strengthen their positions along the German border. The temporary halt in Allied momentum allowed the Germans to plan a counterattack. Hitler refused to accept defeat and insisted that his armies strike back before winter. He believed that a sudden offensive could split the Allied forces and force them to negotiate. German planners chose the Ardennes, a heavily forested region that the Allies considered unlikely for a major attack. The terrain was difficult, and Allied intelligence assumed it could not support a large armored force. This assumption proved costly. In secret, the Germans gathered their remaining strength for a surprise assault. They rebuilt divisions shattered in France and brought in fresh troops and equipment from other theaters. The consequences of Patton's earlier success shaped this German plan. The speed of the Allied advance had left certain areas thinly defended. Supply shortages had slowed the Allies just as they approached Germany's western border. American units in the Ardennes were tired, under-equipped, and spread out over a wide area. The Germans hoped to exploit these weaknesses with a concentrated strike. Their goal was to capture key river crossings and drive to the port of Antwerp, cutting off Allied armies to the north. It was a bold gamble, one that relied on surprise and rapid movement, the very tactics Patton had used so effectively only months before. While the Germans prepared their counteroffensive, the Allies worked to strengthen their logistics and rebuild their own strength. Engineers repaired roads and bridges, supply depots were moved closer to the front, and new units arrived from the United States and Britain. Planning also began for future operations aimed at crossing the Rhine and invading Germany itself. Patton's Third Army remained active during this period, conducting limited offensives and reconnaissance. Even when his tanks were low on fuel, Patton pushed his units to probe enemy positions and keep pressure on the German defenders. He understood that giving the enemy time to rest could be dangerous. The liberation of France also had a major effect on the political landscape. With most of the country free, the French provisional government could begin re-establishing control. French resistance groups were integrated into the regular army. This created a stronger, unified French force that could participate in future battles. It also meant that Allied forces had reliable partners for local security and administration. The rapid collapse of German rule reduced the risk of prolonged guerrilla warfare, which might have drained Allied resources and delayed the advance. Despite these gains, the situation remained fragile. The Germans still held strong defensive lines along the Rhine and in key fortified cities like Metz. Winter was approaching, bringing cold weather and poor conditions for both soldiers and vehicles. Supply problems persisted, and the sheer distance from the ports created constant difficulties. Allied commanders knew that the final phase of the war in Europe would be challenging. The victories of the summer had set the stage, but the hardest battles were still to come. The chain of events triggered by Patton's campaign would soon reach a dramatic point. In December 1944, the Germans launched their surprise offensive in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge would test the Allies in ways they had not faced since Normandy. It was a direct response to the losses suffered during the breakout and pursuit across France. Hitler's gamble was his attempt to undo the damage inflicted by Patton and the other Allied commanders. The outcome of that battle would determine whether Germany could prolong the war or face inevitable defeat. In the months after the campaign across France, military planners and historians began to study what had happened. Patton's drive from Normandy to the German border in just 30 days was unlike anything the Allies had accomplished before. It showed how speed and mobility could overwhelm even well-trained and well-armed forces. The Third Army's actions became a textbook example of modern mobile warfare. Officers who would go on to command armies in later conflicts studied Patton's maneuvers, looking for lessons about timing, coordination, and logistics. His methods shaped the way armored warfare was understood for generations. Patton's approach to battle relied on movement. He believed that striking hard and moving fast created confusion and forced the enemy to react rather than plan. His tanks and infantry did not focus on holding ground. They bypassed strong points, isolated them, and kept going. This tactic required trust between commanders at every level. A battalion leader had to know that he could push forward without waiting for explicit orders, and higher headquarters had to be ready to shift resources quickly when opportunities appeared. Radio communication made this possible. For the first time, a large army could operate at high speed while staying coordinated across a vast area. The campaign also highlighted the central role of logistics. Patton's tanks could not have moved without fuel, spare parts, and ammunition delivered daily. The Red Ball Express became a symbol of the behind-the-scenes effort that powered the advance. Convoys of trucks moved along designated routes under strict control, keeping the flow of supplies constant. Military engineers worked non-stop to repair bridges, build roads, and clear wreckage. Without this infrastructure, the tanks at the front would have been useless. The campaign demonstrated that victory did not come from battlefield tactics alone. It required a vast support system working with precision and speed. For Allied leaders, the liberation of France within weeks was a powerful sign of their growing strength. Only 4 years earlier, German armies had overrun the same ground in a matter of days. Now the roles were reversed. The rapid collapse of German control showed that the tide had turned completely. Allied forces had the manpower, equipment, and coordination to defeat Germany in the West. This success boosted morale among the troops and the civilian populations of the Allied nations. It also reassured political leaders that the enormous resources committed to the war effort were paying off. For the people of France, the speed of the liberation created a sense of renewal. They saw not just the end of occupation, but also the beginning of recovery and rebuilding. Patton's personal reputation grew alongside the achievements of his army. He had been a controversial figure even before the campaign, known for his strict discipline and outspoken nature. His aggressive tactics in France earned him both praise and criticism. Some saw him as reckless, willing to risk high casualties to maintain momentum. Others admired his clarity of purpose and his ability to inspire his troops. Among the soldiers of the Third Army, his presence was felt everywhere. They spoke of his visits to the front, his fiery speeches, and his unrelenting demands for speed. Whether they liked him or feared him, they respected the results he achieved. The public image of Patton became larger than life. Newspapers printed stories of his daring decisions and rapid advances. Photographs of him inspecting the front lines or standing beside his tanks circulated widely. To many in the Allied nations, he came to symbolize the power of the American army. His command of the Third Army was proof that the Allies could match and surpass the famous German blitzkrieg tactics that had dominated the early years of the war. This shift in perception mattered. It showed that the Allies were no longer just reacting to German moves. They were now driving the course of the war. The events of that summer also influenced the overall strategy of the Allies. Before the breakout, there had been debate over how best to conduct the campaign in Western Europe. Some leaders favored cautious advances with secure flanks, while others argued for bold thrusts deep into enemy territory. Patton's success gave weight to the idea that speed could be decisive. It demonstrated that a rapid, aggressive offensive could destroy enemy formations before they could recover. This lesson shaped future operations, including the final push into Germany the following spring. Military academies around the world studied the campaign in detail after the war. Staff officers pored over maps and reports, tracing the movements of divisions and corps. They analyzed how decisions were made and how problems were solved. Patton's emphasis on initiative, logistics, and speed became core principles in modern doctrine. Even decades later, his campaign across France was cited as an example of how to conduct large-scale armored operations. It stood alongside other great maneuvers in military history as a case study in operational art. The legacy of the campaign was not only in military theory. It left lasting impressions on those who experienced it. French civilians remembered the sudden appearance of American tanks rolling through their streets, the cheers and celebrations, and the return of freedom. Veterans of the Third Army carried memories of long, exhausting marches, fierce battles, and moments of triumph. For many, the campaign was the defining event of their service. It was a time when everything seemed possible, when the tide of war shifted visibly before their eyes. The operation also altered how future conflicts were imagined. Military leaders understood that wars would no longer be won solely by massed infantry assaults. Mobility, coordination, and supply would define success. Patton's campaign provided a model for the kind of fast, flexible warfare that became central to military thinking in the second half of the 20th century. His actions proved that a well-led and well-supplied force could achieve results that seemed impossible only weeks earlier. As the war continued into Germany and beyond, the story of the Third Army's drive across France remained a touchstone. It represented a moment when preparation, leadership, and opportunity came together in a way that changed history. The campaign's speed and scale set a new standard for what modern armies could achieve, and it left a legacy that shaped military strategy for generations.